just have to say it's been an amazing experience to work with you at the opera, developing the last 4 years this very complicated opera. It's your, is that your fourth opera?
The fourth large scale,
fourth opera production. It's a strange and wonderful art form, as you well know, with limitations, but also endless possibilities. And somehow you've touched operas which are not really realistic operas, I would have thought. And in one sense, Lulu is perhaps the most realistic of all the operas you've done so far, no?
Well, I mean, Lulu is, I mean, it's dialogue, it's people talking to each other for the 3 hours, with Alban Berg's music behind Frank Wedekind's plays. It really is a play, or 2 plays set to music. So in that sense, it's more naturalist than the others. But there is obviously the fundamental artificiality of the form of opera, the anti-naturalism of opera, which is fantastic to work with. You can do a production of Lulu that looks like a 1920s film. You can do a completely cinematic in which the music becomes a very lush score for a film. But I'm interested in all the other kind of fractures that opera makes, the obvious ones. That a thought which might take 1 second in your brain, which might take 6 seconds to say as a sentence, becomes a 40-second phrase of music as it gets expanded or contracted and shifted. So you're already in a world of different pauses, of holding time, of expanding, of contracting time within it. So that already gives an anti-naturalism that opens up many possibilities for what people are thinking while they're singing or while they're talking, which becomes, of course, the world for the projections, for the visual language of the opera.
remember when you started, the first thing that came into your mind were the woodcuts being a source of inspiration. So obviously going back to these movies, which are about the context of Berlin, and it's quite surprising to see in the first movie how well dressed everybody is. It's quite amazing. In an opera production, we thought it's very artificial to see people dressed like that, but in reality, everybody was dressed like that in the streets. You've obviously followed the period. And
we followed it in two ways. I mean, there are references to the silent films, to the documentary about Berlin, and to other films, narrative films from the period, which is one kind of remarkable image making in Germany at the time. And the other route which has been followed has been the route of the woodcuts of the expressionists and the Neue Sachlichkeit artists, going from Kirchner through to Beckmann. And so you both have the black and white gradations of cinema, of black and white photography, but you also have the extraordinary acid colours in Kirchner woodcuts, in Beckmann paintings, which becomes another kind of language. And the project started really for me when I understood the way in which one could use the language of black and white graphics, lino cuts woodcuts in the part of the German expressionist lino cuts, in the way that I'd been working for a year or so before I started on the project, to understand that could be trying to find the violence in the image that has a matching to the violence of the world and the relationships depicted in the opera. And then of course it expands, in which the black ink of the print, or in my case the Indian ink drawings which they've done, becomes like the blood of the different people who are killed. So it's, the films that we've just seen were an important early source for thinking about it. The photographs that you see behind obviously echo both much more the colour palette of the violence of the 1915 to 1930 expressionists and Neue Sachlichkeit painters.
The opera starts with this extraordinary scene of the animal trainer who has this metaphorical speech about a man, woman, animal, which of course gives the cue a little bit to the whole language that you develop through the production.
The language actually comes out of the second scene, and it gets fed back into it. I mean, the starting off with this Barker who introduces all the characters that you're going to see, and says it's not going to be a quiet little domestic cat that you're going to see. You're going to see real schöne, wilde animals that are going to be on it. But the first scene of the opera is in an artist's studio, and it's an artist making an image of Lulu. And even though he dies at the end of scene 2, the first husband dies at the end of scene 1, when he sees Lulu entwined with the artist. The second scene is Lulu living with the artist, and when the artist realizes he's not the only man in her life, he slits his throat. So, as a character, he disappears after scene 2. But even within the text of the play, and certainly the opera, his echo continues. In the opera and the play, it continues in that his portrait of Lulu is there in all the subsequent scenes. And so that enabled us to say, all right, the language that we're working with is the language we've seen being constructed in the artist's studio. And this language of ink drawings of fragmented sheets of paper which together constitute the portrait. The portrait of Lulu is a pile of drawings in a portfolio rather than a single oil portrait. That can feed all the way through the kind of paper masks and sections of breasts and pubis which are pinned on, also feed their way through the rest of the production.
I think for the audience here that doesn't really know how you work on opera, it's interesting perhaps to evoke the fact that your method is very extensive. You spend years working on an opera production. So you have in South Africa, where your studio is, you develop workshops, several workshops which allow you to develop the production, the imagery. You try out everything almost in advance in a kind of fake set in your studio. Your model is already animated with film. and you have actors taking the roles of singers. Perhaps you want to say a little more about that.
I mean, you've described it extremely accurately. I mean, all the productions, the secret behind them, in many ways, is the pleasure of working with this particular group of collaborators that I've worked with for many years. And you say, what is the next piece we will work on together? But in fact, the workshops are completely productive in terms of allowing everybody, from set designer to lighting to costume to video editing to construction, to be in the same room working together to see what the piece will be. And of course, the really productive conversations happen in the swimming pool afterwards, when we think we're not working, where suddenly new ideas come. So that's an important collaborative part of the process. And another important part is starting with a lot of uncertainty on everyone's part. So if a set designer were to arrive and say, right, this is the set, it's finished here, I've done the design, before we begin, that kind of paralyzes me. I need collaborators who say, well, we don't know what we're doing yet, but here are different possibilities we can start to play with and see how. So when people say, I don't know what to do, that's the right answer for me. That's very reassuring. When people say, I've got an absolutely clear idea, I get terrified. And that's, if you're making a drawing, that's kind of obvious. The drawing is always a sort of a negotiation and dialogue between what you think you're going to make and the mark as it appears on the sheet of paper, and then responding to the first mark that you've made and allowing it to develop from it. So that at the end you do have a finished drawing, but it's not something you could have anticipated entirely in the beginning. And as I try to say to the singers, at the end we will have a coherent production and everybody will know exactly where they have to be at every moment. But I don't start the process knowing that when we come into the rehearsal room or when we start working on the project.
What struck me as being really very distinctive about your production is the intimacy that you managed to find in the storytelling, and that comes from the way the scenes are staged in an architectural space, although of course a single projector projecting very complicated images is continuously at work throughout the whole performance, like the orchestra is playing a very complicated score from beginning to end. How do you orchestrate the visuals in the production, and how do you reconcile them with the audience having to follow a very complicated narrative between characters?
I mean, that's obviously becomes the crux of the final staging, and that will be kind of judged on tomorrow night's dress rehearsal or Monday's premiere. I would say there are three productions that sort of happen. The first is in the studio with a large-scale model, which is made of much larger than usual theatrical models, big enough for us to really test out carefully the projections and to have figurines more or less to scale within the set. So the model is about the size of a grand piano, it's that sort of scale, and not the usual small box that would be done. And we try to anticipate, all the editors, Catherine Myberg and Shana, try to work as far as we can in anticipating what the singers will be doing and how to structure the video around the anticipation and audience watching the singers inside the images. And that's the first that we've spent months and months working on. And then there's a period of rehearsal, the first 4 weeks of rehearsal here, where there's just the singers and a reference video, but not a full projection, in which a kind of second production happens. And then there's the work of the last 2 weeks in which the two kind of smash together, where suddenly we have the acting as it's been worked on by myself and Luc de Witt, who's the co-director of the staging, together with the projections and the work of Schönebaum, the lighting designer. And that's a time when, as much as we thought we had anticipated how everything would work with singers, there's a huge editing. So the editor is here for a month, re-editing up till really the dress rehearsal. The final changes will happen tomorrow. And then there's a whole subtext of how you keep the image in sync with the orchestra. So the orchestra's not having to, the conductor doesn't have to watch the image and be anxious that he's getting out of sync with the film. We have ways of driving the film and pausing and playing, very carefully structured to follow it. But that balance is, of course, the test. And one of the interesting things is that I think we found that when the images are at their richest, at their densest, at their most black, when the stage light in a way is almost reduced to a pool of light in which you can see the two singers, they sit most comfortably inside the drawings and you read the story, you follow them very clearly. Yeah. But I mean, having said that, I know there will be people who will say, my God, please switch off the projector and let us see the opera. And other people say, please tell the people to be quiet so we can see the projection. And it is the opera is a form of excess, as you know as well, of too much. There's always too much. astonishing. Every
Astonishing.
every frame, every moment of that film, and the performance of Louise Brooks, of course.
The first question I think probably some people have for you is with a figure like Lulu, who is a sort of sex symbol or very superficially seen in that way. A production, of course, needs to kind of decide what that character is. Is it a child? Is it a knowing, manipulative woman who knows everything as she's doing it? How responsible is she for her actions? What her role in that society really is? How did you approach that theme?
I approached it saying, let's keep it open as to who Lulu is and discover who she is, rather than say she was abused as a child, so that explains how she is, or she's simply out to get as much money as she can from the men, or she's simply a victim, to allow it to have all those different elements and possibilities. And of course what emerges is the sum total of who Lulu is on stage is a mixture between the impulses that the singer, Moitze Erdmann, gives, and it shows who she is. I mean, in the end, the singer can't hide. The nature and character of the singer is there in the character, particularly with a role like this. But to keep that open and to discover at the end what is it that moves her instead of what is it that motivates. There are a lot of clues in the text of directions to go, but I would say the interest in the opera and in the play over the years, particularly the opera, is that you can't really define her. Each time you give her, to say she's a sex symbol or she's a femme fatale, you're already defining an interpretation. And all of those things are present in her, but I think there are other things. They always kind of then sit as judgments of her. And for me, the interesting thing is that it's the men in the opera who have to make the ethical decisions and always come up short. She's very straight about who she is and what she's done. And Alva, the son of her main lover, who's desperately in love with her, as he completely gives himself to her, she says to him first, remember that I poisoned your mother. And that's his moment. He can either recoil and say, well, I don't have anything to do with you, or he can kind of choose not to hear it and still wrap his arms around her. And later on, when he's completely given himself to her, she says, the sofa we're sitting on, isn't this where your father bled to death after she'd shot him? And he can only just say, quiet, quiet, let's go. And so the idea of saying, oh, it's an opera which shows the perfidy of women or the danger of the women's eros as a destructive thing, I think is a limited reading of what the possibilities in the opera. I mean, the opera is an opera about obsession and desire and the instability of desire. That Lulu can never be the woman the men hope she will be, that they project onto her. She's not the faithful muse that the artist hopes for. She's not the controllable woman that the main lover Schoen hopes she will be. And the men always fall short, of course, for Lulu, with their excessive demands, with not accepting her, how she is. So in that sense, it's certainly a cruel opera.
Yeah.
It's an opera of cruelty, of people's unbelievable lack of empathy for the people around them. And in that sense, it seems a very appropriate opera for the 1920s and early 30s in Europe. You say, how do you bring all the nastiness of the real politic of the time from the streets into a boudoir, and you have a kind of real politic of sex.
But it's also an opera about money, because the economic dimension, of course, the volcano, the dancing on the volcano aspect is still actual,
yeah.
And it's about exploitation.
It's about exploitation, but there's a great scene, the second last scene, which is set in Paris, in fact. It's one of the scenes that Berg himself didn't manage to complete the orchestration for. And some productions leave it out entirely, but it's a scene in which there's a mixture of people making money on the stock market, during the course of the 25 minutes of the scene, the stocks in one particular, the Jungfrau shares, go sky high, and everybody's trying to buy as many shares as they can from the bank director in between gambling. And at the end of the 25 minutes, the shares are worthless. The bubble is burst and they've crashed and everybody's destroyed. And in between, people have tried to blackmail Lulu, and there's a... So that mixture between kind of the libido of making money and the violence of losing money, of that desperation. And that translated into people saying, well, either you're going to find me the money, or I'm going to get the reward for handing you over to the German police, or the option I would like best, the Marquis says to her, is to sell you to a brothel in Cairo for 1,200 marks. I'll get 200 marks more for you. There's a crass transactional violence in it.
Yeah, I think in your staging, what I found very beautiful is that you managed to break the intimacy that you set up, which you find again in the London scene at the end, but in a very surprising way, by holding back the space and holding back a lot of I would call them tricks, but they're not really tricks, but tricks as much as a Russian roulette is a trick for that scene. And I find that a lot of the animation dimension of what you do around the singers makes sense in that scene totally.
And it is a crazy... it's interesting doing Lulu just after having done The Nose, which was the Shostakovich opera written in 1928. He'd seen Wozzeck of Alban Berg, so it was very influenced by Berg, the Shostakovich, and then this happens after Shostakovich's The Nose. And although I don't know anything about Berg, having seen or heard about the Shostakovich, the scene in Paris is a kind of echo of a wild scene, crowd scene in the Berg opera. Of character there, in the way in which a character will appear for 2 lines, and has to be a clear character, and then they will disappear into the crowd, never to be seen again. And that sense of having to bring someone for a minute role, and then disappear, and so constitute the community from these tiny vignettes, is something that's common. So you have crowd, you have ensembles which are quite chaotic, but within that chaos there are particular fights between Lulu and her woman lover, between the bank director and a mother who's trying to sell her 15-year-old daughter to pimp standing at the side of the room. These all happen inside an octet of people all singing at the same time. And to try to get that visible, there, let me say, I hand over to Luke, my assistant, and I say, here's the crowds, work out it's a bit like a military map. Here you all move here, and this person will come down, and then you'll encircle you with the waiter handing out money, and then the waiter has to go so the next 3 people can come down, and you've got 7 seconds to get up the staircase inside the clock.
One other crucial theme in the piece are all the generations of men that deal with this young woman. Of course, one woman, Kentridge, is a sort of sings this kind of pietà at the end of the piece, which is almost kind of a religious moment in the piece. How do you feel about this amazing carnival of generations which are gravitating around this woman?
There too, I mean, I think you're right about with something that I've discovered in the production. Geschwitz, who is the woman lover of Lulu, and in a way is the most faithful and devoted of all the people in the opera, who follows her to destitution in London and gets stabbed by Jack the Ripper sort of as a postscript, as a footnote in passing. Does, as you say, have the most moving music. Just at the end, she sings twice, and each of those you suddenly feel the human cost of the journey you've been on. Where she says it's not even worth killing herself because Lulu's not going to shed a single tear for her if she did. But the generations, and there becomes a practical question. You have a character who is the father, the main lover of Lulu, and you have his son who is always hoping his father will make Lulu an honourable woman and do the honourable thing and marry her, but he's completely in love with her. But we have 2 very different looking singers, and to make a familial resemblance, in fact, the great skill of your makeup department and wig department at the opera. So we decided to give them both the same hairline, so the father has a lot less hair than the son, but a distinctive familial hairline. And then they each have the same nose. We cast prosthetic noses, so they have identity. So even though there's something about them that makes it completely coherent that these are of the same family, it has to do with the profile and hairline. So that's a kind of the way in which I wasn't thinking of the grand theme. What do I think about the generations? For me, it gets translated into practically on stage. How do we turn that in? But it's also quite unclear, quite the age that Lulu is. There are different contradictory clues in the opera. Is she 18? She can't be 18 because she said she was taken off the streets 15 years ago, which would have made her 3 at the time. So maybe she was a very young, sort of destitute woman selling herself for sex at 14 or 15, which would then make her in her mid-20s, but then she has 2 years in prison. She says when she comes back from prison, she's only in prison for 6 months, but she returns and says it's 2 years since I last was in a sitting room, so the time gets expanded and shifted. So she's anywhere between her mid or late 20s to however far you want to take her, although she's usually portrayed as a very, very young woman.
One of the most moving parts, apart from issues at the end, but for me, always seeing this opera are the scenes with Shigov. That's the happiest. They're the happiest scenes of the opera.
They're also the most perverse in a strange way.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's a character who, again, if you ask different people who've worked closely on them, studied, is he actually her father? Is he a father-like figure, but in fact was the first person who abused her and was her first pimp? It's not clear. They obviously had some sexual relationship much earlier on, and part of that intimacy is still remembered with warmth by Lulu, but she recoils when he still tries, as it were, to rekindle that, or hope she can rekindle it. And he's doing that not in fact because he feels he wants to do it, but because he's hoping to get 300 marks out of her. But there is still a residue of actual, there's a kind of crass, fake tenderness masking a real tenderness. And I think that's the irony that's in the music and in what
it's amazing. For some reason, when I hear these scenes, they remind me of The Last Tango in Paris. Somehow the atmosphere of that film and what stands behind those relationships comes back to me when I see those scenes with Shigov. It's very moving.
I mean, and with our singer, who's a man of good years, who's singing on the stage.
Great singer.
Fantastic.
Very famous Waltz.
Right.
Yeah.
And it
very,
was, I
very
think,
famous. Perhaps the most famous. Yeah.
It kind of also does give it a different, when he's walking, there's a way in which an actor can act the old man, and they bend forward and they put your hand on your back and you walk as an old man. And there's something very different of actually what happens to the anatomy of an older, tired body, still walking up and down the stairs that he has to do. There is something moving in seeing that. Your eye is very attuned to say, is this a young actor doing a great performance of an old man? And there's some way where you actually register the years in that real walk.
course, this end of Lulu is a form of suicide, isn't it?
Well, she says earlier on in the opera, as I grew to maturity, I could tell at 100 yards in the dark if the man ahead of me was made for me. And that for me was a kind of clue, because in the end, Jack is the person she has various other clients, but he's the one who says, well, I'm not going to pay you anything, but she says, I still want to. There's this, it reaches the realm of saying that the cost of these impossible desires is destruction, in this case, death all the way through, and it's, the operatic shape of it has to end with it. There's also the sense of the moral economy of narrative, that if you yourself have killed someone, then at a certain point you'll pay the price. And she shot Shern in the back 5 times, so you know at a certain point she's going to have to pay for that, which she does with Jack. But we have it in the production. It's sort of an echo in that when she talks about I used to be a foolish goose, but now at 100 yards I can tell if the man in the dark, I can tell if the man ahead is the man for me. We have an image of a face that represents Jack. And then later on in London, 2 hours later in the opera, you see that same face again and understand that's the person.
Do you think an opera can have a kind of moral power? Do you think a piece like that has a message, or do you think?
No, I don't think it can have a. I don't see it as having a message. If it has a message, it has to be explained to me what the message is that we have done. It can raise a series of questions, the nature of obsession, of desire. And these are, they're big questions, but they're posed in very practical senses, as you would know. When you're staging it, it's the minutiae that actually pose the big question. So, are the men obsessed with Lulu because she seduces them and is available and shows herself to them? Or is the obsession sometimes generated by her indifference? And the obsession is to somehow break through the indifference she has to the men at different points, is what drives the men crazy.
That's a very strong aspect of your production, because at many moments she abandons the man she's talking to and sings almost straight out to the audience these strange little arias that punctuate the piece. Do you have did that obviously on purpose?
It's a mixture of, it's a negotiation between the way the singer feels comfortable in singing that moment. So you can say, well, here I need you to sing your main Lulu aria with your 2 legs up on the sofa, hunched over like that. And there's one sort of image in that. And there's another image, she says, no, actually here, this is a moment when I've recovered and I'm feeling fine and I'm singing it straight out like that. And at a certain point it's important that the moment for the singer also feels right. And that's when the space when the character is also starts to be defined by the singer herself, in this case Lulu, rather than just an imposed image from outside, as it were. And so sometimes she's more, there's a balance. Sometimes I think we're too much to the audience, sometimes it's back. But to go back to the minutiae, it's often a question of timing and space. So if the artist pushes her face to pose her and releases her, and she swings around, there's a certain kind of engagement. And if she just also, when she's posed, she simply refuses to do it until he comes to her and then she does it again. There's a whole seduction or drama of power or not power, of caring or not caring in those micro movements. In a way, those carry the meaning more than the broad gestures. And those are also less predictable for me, I'm sure you.
Yeah. No, it's obviously...
I should really be asking you all these questions, although I should have asked you these 7 weeks ago, because you have so much more experience in knowing how to drive this very strange machine of an opera.
some people sitting in the audience know a little bit about my philosophy. I'm personally fascinated by the fact that a director's work is defined by what he or she doesn't do, chooses not to do. Because in this piece you can, Lulu is a piece that you can over-direct, over-produce incredibly. It's got a kind of theatrical expressionism that is endless, what you can do. I mean, we've seen in the Borowczyk film a Lulu that's naked all the time. I've seen actually a production of Lulu where the Lulu was totally naked as a singer for the whole opera. So I mean, there are lots of possibilities.
I'm interested to know how that worked. I mean, that was a question. I've seen a video of a stage production in which she's, fantastic production, which she's naked for a lot of it. And I'm interested to know how that worked with the music. How the nakedness and the, if those jarred or if that's fine.
It's possible. It's just for me what is it feels occasionally easy to do that and launch into a kind of the contrast word between, you know, a free agent as Lulu who can do that and the other person who are constricted by or driven crazy by that behavior. I think you chose also sometimes, I've seen you also change the costumes over the rehearsals. You were really debating what sort of bra she should wear constantly, and you changed the bras all the time, and you eventually decided to choose for a very plain, simple bra because you wanted her not to look like a whore.
Well, I wanted her not to look like a Victoria's Secret advertisement. That was it had to have an awkwardness. So the costume designer critic has found this. I mean, we went through many, from linen underwear to hand knitted woolen underwear to 1920s period pieces to recreations of period pieces, to find something that both could work for the whole length, but had something of an awkwardness, and the awkwardness would give a kind of vulnerability. And there I can assure you it is a real negotiation with the singer and the costume designer as to what absolutely won't be worn, what will be worn. Millimeters are at issue here. But I think we found, and within the group of all of us sitting at the table looking and holding different pieces of cloth under the lights to say, well, is this pink too pink? Is this too flesh-toned? If we put a different cloth underneath a lace, does it change how you can read it in this scene or that scene? There's not unanimity and there's not kind of consensus, and they all work and have different echoes of different things.
Of course, the two worlds that also polarize the piece in terms of form are the world of the theatre, because of course there's big theatre scene, and also the world of the circus with the animals. So obviously there's a vertical and a horizontal level which work very well with your graphic work.
Yes, I mean, interesting with Lulu's costume, the big decision was to say she'll never have her own clothes, really. She'll always be, she's a model, so she's posed in clothes for the artist. When she goes off in the coat of the husband who's just died. In the next scene, she's wearing the jersey of her new husband. In the next scene, she's wearing a shirt, a starched white shirt of Schoen, who's going to get dressed. In the theatre scene, she's in a theatre costume that comes from the artist's studio. In Paris, she does have her own paper dress, but it's also a dress from the artist's studio. And in London, on the street, she just has the jacket of Alva, the son of her main lover. And that were kind of easily and without any controversy or question. It's the glimpses of the particular pink or the particular black or the nature of the knitting or the nature of the sewing of her knickers that becomes the minutiae in which a lot is worked out.
We saw in this theatre a two-act version of Lulu in our theatre. We saw in my first season as artistic director of the Holland Festival in 2005, a Lulu by Peter Konvichny, a great director, with Marlies Peterson, who will sing this role for you in New York. And now we see this version with Mr. Edman in this particular production. It's for me very interesting to have seen this transformation in one space of 3 productions. And I still, when I watched your production, I sort of forgot the others. You managed to create a world which is so specific that somehow it has its own authority and its own rules. And I'm glad to hear you have arrived at it very organically, because I think that's the most interesting way to make an opera production. It's also very different from your other opera productions. How do you feel about that?
Well, it feels the same. It feels the same in one sense, that it's this mixture of a world which is both the set, which is designed by Sabine Tjernesen, which is both a space in itself and is also a space to receive projections. And quite a, there's a lot of detail in the set, but it's extraordinary how when you project onto them, they get swallowed by that projection. So that's common to them all, but the technique of drawing, the technique of animation is very different, from charcoal animation with magic flute to the torn paper animation to this, which is really a series of drawings which get replaced rather than real animation.
Yeah.
So from the inside they feel, it feels a continuous process. It doesn't feel an enormous difference.
I'll ask you a last question, which always interests me, because in all my life I've asked so many people who have not done operas to do operas, and often you reach the answer that they have no time, that their main occupation prevents them from diverting themselves into the opera form. It's too complicated, they wouldn't know how to approach it. You're one of the greatest artists on the planet, and at the same time you've devoted a great deal of time to opera, and you're the only one who has managed to, instead of looking at it as a possible annoyance or a waste of your time as an artist, you've managed to turn it into something very creative for the rest of your oeuvre. What do you think about that?
Well, I think in one sense you've got to understand it's the treat I give myself every 5 years or every 3 years to have this focus. It's a luxury as a director to say, I'm not doing 5 productions here, I'm doing one in over several years. But it's also, what's vital is that from the work, there's the work of making the opera, making the drawings for it, and the directing the singers, and everything that will come together on Monday night. But along the way there are so many other sideways thoughts that start to emerge, which feed into things that are drawn. So there are many drawings that emerge that would never have been made if I was simply making drawings. It's the fact that that it's a kind of applied art, you could call it. It's drawings or ink drawings made in the service of the needs of the narrative of the opera. And this means that there are pushes and prods into the image making, into the idea of sculpture, into all sorts of things that would never happen otherwise. So that's the richness. And there's a migration of things from one form to another, one project to another, from something that starts as a drawing, ends up as a central part of an opera, turns into a series of etchings, has an idea for a sculpture, which comes back into another piece of theatre. So that journey and migration is vital. So I don't begrudge, I'm grateful for all the time that.
But I think the public in Amsterdam can be grateful that they've managed within a year to see your Winterreise here last year, to see the installation that you've created especially for the Eye Museum that opened a few weeks ago, and to be able to see that wonderful installation and see the connections, for instance, with the Lulu production, because in the Lulu production one of the other leitmotifs that comes back are all the faces of the men. All sorts of portraits come back constantly in the design.
It does, but there's another even stronger connection which I keep forgetting, but it is there. In Lulu, at the end of the first scene, when the first husband dies, the line about him, she says, is, "His dance is over. Der Tanz ist aus." And in a way that sets the clue to thinking about the opera itself as a dance of death. And in fact, we have a character, one of the actors, Andrea, we discovered only after many weeks of working with him that what he actually is kind of this death figure that moves through, giving everybody their weapon that they're going to kill themselves with. But the idea of a dance of death then sent me to look at those old medieval images of death accompanying everyone, from the Pope to the king, to the bishop, to the priest, to the farmer, to the serf, to the child, that everybody was subject to the rule of death during the plague years particularly. They were drawn in that time. But that gave the idea of this long frieze form of this dance of death, which obviously became the starting point for the piece of More Sweetly Play the Dance. So that the piece here at the Eye Museum is called More Sweetly Play the Dance, and the very end, instead of saying the end or finis on the opera production, we say Der Tanz ist aus, the dance is finished, which in a way is a connection back here also. Even though I'd forgotten about that for the months of working on that project, it came back as we were doing it again.